All right, folks, it has been a stressful November and a stressful election season with COVID cases on the rise and the lawsuits involving the election also on the rise. So I'm going to get myself a cup of coffee, and why don't you all take 10 seconds to watch a video of the least political animal on this planet, the majestic river otter. In a DK Metcalf-like comeback, Joe Biden seemed to creep up on Donald Trump like he was sprinting after Buda Baker. And a few days later, as we all know, the AP and the other news outlets announced the election for Joseph Biden, but the Trump administration, along with other Republican officials, have filed, to our count, 19 different lawsuits in several different states. By the end of this video, I hope that we'll answer two questions. One, what is going on with these lawsuits? And two, are they even legitimate? The lawsuits that have been filed boil down to two basic allegations. First, that there's some sort of fraud in the way that the elections have been held out. The second involves ballots that the Republican Party thinks that shouldn't be counted at all. This is where you start talking about whether ballots were cast on election day or if they were collected after election day and the timing of when ballots can be cast. The cases involving fraud, which frankly is the biggest political issue and the thing that all of us are seeing on the news every single day. The question is just purely, hey, we think that the election people, the board of electors, the people that are counting these ballots, are doing something that doesn't pass the smell test. So what may be helpful is if we actually look at one of the lawsuits that's talking about the fraud or alleging that there's fraud taking place. In Georgia, one of the lawsuits that was filed, there was a poll worker that was present for the Republican Party who said in an affidavit, in accordance with my training and experience, the actions taken by poll workers do not comply with Georgia law's safeguards to ensure chain of custody. I have been provided no reasonable explanation as to why an exception to the procedure occurred. The allegation in this case was whether there are certain ballots that made their way into a box that were going to be counted as absentee ballots that shouldn't have been there in the first place. And this person filed this affidavit saying, he doesn't know how the ballots got into the box, he doesn't know where the ballots came from. In the order, the judge said, having read and considered the petition, all argument and evidence of record, the court finds that there is no evidence that the ballots referenced in the petition were received after 7 p.m. on election day, thereby making those ballots invalid. Additionally, there is no evidence that the Board of Elections has failed to comply with the law. So what we're finding in this lawsuit is pretty consistent with the other lawsuits that have been filed that allege fraud. A general theme is that these complaints are saying these bad things are happening. And you can see that if you follow Donald Trump's Twitter feed. These bad things are just happening. We don't know exactly when it happened. We don't know where these ballots came from. We don't know if somebody is actually voting illegally or not, but we think that they are. Let's look at one of these affidavits from Andrew Sito. He's a Republican challenger, and he alleges that there were ballots delivered to the voting center from a different door that wasn't used otherwise, and they were delivered by trucks that had out-of-state license plates, and that based on the ballots that he saw, all of those ballots were for Vice President Joe Biden. Okay, considering those three facts, it doesn't look good. So then we have Larson. Larson is an attorney, and Larson's allegations are really about two things. First, he says that they didn't verify the eligibility of voters on the absentee ballots that were counted. And second, he says that when he left the facility for lunch on the day after the election, they didn't let him back in to be a poll watcher because he was a Republican challenger. The judge ultimately denied the request that the counting of these ballots stop. And you may be thinking what I was thinking when I first read the affidavits, which is, why would you deny this request if it sounds like people have some reason, or maybe even some good reason, to think that there was some sort of fraud or bad actions taking place at this center. When we're talking about Mr. Sito, and remember, Mr. Sito is the guy that said, truckloads of votes go on the table, all for Biden, out-of-state plates. The court said this specifically, and I'm going to read it for you. Mr. Sito's affidavit, while stating a few general facts, is rife with speculation and guesswork about sinister motives. Mr. Sito knew little about the process of the absentee voter counting board activity. His sinister motives attributed to the city of Detroit were negated by Christopher Thomas's explanation that all the ballots were delivered to the back of the hall at the TCF Center. Thomas also indicated that the city utilized a rental truck to deliver ballots. There is no evidentiary basis to attribute any evil activity by virtue of the city using a rental truck with out-of-state license plates. When we get to Mr. Larson's claims, first, the court points out that his allegations that there wasn't any verification of voter eligibility was unfounded because the voter eligibility was determined at a different location in Detroit before the ballots even came to this center to be counted. When we're talking about whether or not Mr. Larson was properly let into the facility to be a poll watcher, the court noted and pointed out that both Democratic and Republican challengers were not let into the building after a certain period of time because of COVID restrictions. There are just too many people in the building. It didn't matter that he was Republican or a Democrat. And so when we look at these facts, based on what was alleged in these affidavits by these people who think that there was fraud that occurred, and then we compare them to the benign or the facts that are sort of plain Jane that explain what was happening on the ground floor, the judge found that there wasn't good enough reason for the court to go through the drastic measure of stopping the election process and potentially taking away the voters' choice in Michigan by not allowing the electors to certify the election on December 14th, 2020. Are these lawsuits legitimate? If you look and count up the votes that are actually specifically challenged in all of these lawsuits, it makes up a few thousand votes. That wouldn't change the election one way or the other in any of the states that the lawsuits were brought in. So we have to ask ourselves, what's the real reason behind these lawsuits? Is he doing it out of an altruistic desire to ensure the sanctity of our democracy and the voting structure for elections to come in many years down the road? Or is it for another purpose that may be a little bit more consistent with his character that we've seen for the last 4 years? Because if the purpose of these lawsuits is to create doubt or delegitimize our democracy without actual proof in our justice system, those aren't legitimate lawsuits. The good news is, at this point, you've done your duty. We've done our duty. We voted, and it's up to us to now wait and see how the justice system resolves some of these issues. And I, for one, have complete faith that they'll get it right. And in that spirit, we'll let the otters send us off.